Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Gabriel Allen Cummings.
And I'm Sonika Garcia, and this is Breaking the Code,
A podcast series by the Havas Medical Anthropology team. We're here to take the BS out of behavioral science by illuminating the why behind the what of behaviors, rituals, and symbols that people take for granted. We hope to arm you, our listeners, with the tools you need to make sense of behavioral science and help you apply it to your work as communication extraordinaires.
Today's episode, we want to talk all about consumer insight generation. I don't know what the catchy topic or title will be, but within medical anthropology, we're often tasked with understanding how do we better understand the consumer? How do we better understand the patient or the doctor? And like strategists and creatives and just the entire marketing team as a whole, we are always striving to find new insight, things that people have not uncovered yet, new ways of thinking to bring to our clients. And I know these conversations are happening across the board, but I know within our team, it's often how do we get to things that are different? We struggle. We do research, we do social listening, and we're like, this isn't interesting. This isn't the key. How do we get to really cracking, what that meaningful insight is, that meaningful human insight? And so we want to use this episode and we want to have this discussion around how can we push the thinking, and let me just start by saying we don't have the answers. It's just stuff that, us as a team, we're always kicking back and forth, how do we dig deeper? And so we want to have the conversation with all of you. And of course, as always, would love to hear back, what are ways and what are approaches and how can we push the needle on getting to that insight that truly is earth shattering, for lack of just really meaningful and breakthrough. That's a good word. What is that? What are those insights that are truly breakthrough? And so, Gabe, anything I'm missing?
I mean, I would just say that, and I don't think there's anything really missing, but I would just say that it's an analysis of our own bias. I feel like a lot of times when we're medical communicators, we're able to look at the behaviors of patients, we're able to look at the behaviors of doctors, and we're really able to crack down why. And I mean, that's going to be a bit of the conversation we have today as far as our approach to cracking down why, but it's kind of looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying, where are we getting caught up in the process of finding these truths?
Yeah, I love that. So I think the first point that I want to make is we always say, behavioral science is understanding how human beings make decisions, right? And then we say to our clients and, just us as, a team, and we say across the board, right? Let's talk about patients and doctors, but let's, they're humans first. Let's strip away their title of being a patient living with a certain condition or a doctor treating a certain condition. And so we know that health decisions don't happen in isolation. We have said that the experiences that this human being, whether you're a doctor or patient, had up until a certain moment that, they're engaging with our brand, really shape who they are. And we need to look at things like, what are their daily routines, habits, brand preferences? How do we understand this person outside of the healthcare decision-making context? Because again, people don't make health decisions so differently than they make other decisions. And then to that same point, understanding, self-identity over patient or HCP identity. People don't define themselves by their disease. They define that's part of them, but there's also a whole other part of them. And so all this to say, when we know this truth, we've talked about it before on the podcast, we have these conversations every day, but what does it really mean? And what does it really take to have that approach when we are generating or before even generating, digging for and researching health behavior or researching for a particular brand? How do we even approach primary research or secondary social listening research from a human first and overall behavior first mentality and approach? How do we not get suckered into thinking about someone's simply through the lens or solely through the lens of this is a patient or this is a doctor. And I don't have the answer, but I think something that we've talked about with the medical anthropology is, as we're doing social listening, we have some really cool tools, and we'll have to do another episode on how we approach social listening and research and basically culture scans. And we're often tasked a lot with that sort of analysis. But I think what we've done is we're very mindful of confirmation bias. We're very mindful of search queries giving us like what we expect to uncover, or limiting a person to a certain health title that they have or a health behavior. So that's for one. I think doing social listening and queries, we try to keep it as broad as possible. But I think then finding ways, what do you do next? You do a broad search, but then how do you actually get to that meaningful insight? And that'll have to be another episode as well, as we learn with all of you and as we, do that with everyone else. I think another piece of it is, even the way that we create discussion guides. I know we had an episode, many moons ago about discussion guides. And I think it's just really thinking about how broad we have to ask a question to then be able to have people give a response that's not leading, and then have the tools as strategists to be able to pull out, okay, well, what's this person really saying, or what are some conclusions that we can draw from this? Because I think we get suckered into a lot of times, or we want to find something out. And so let's create a really tight discussion guide, so we're getting very specific answers that we need in this 30-minute or hour session. And that's not how we're going to get new stuff. And it's frustrating. And I feel like I've just talked a lot. Gabe, please jump in. But I can go on and on. I think there's a lot of there's a lot to explore here.
I mean, I will add, when it comes to interviews, discussion guides, even reading the transcript, and that's, from that episode many moons ago, that was one of the points that we were making there too, where reading the transcript won't give you the full understanding of what a person is trying to say. And This kind of gets into our second point, where we've titled these points. I'll read the second title. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but the power of the unspoken. And I think that is really a conversation about, we're good at really tracking what our people are saying and what people are saying at high frequencies. But that's not the only thing that matters. If we were to just, boil it down to a numbers game and we come away with a bag of words, if you will, then sure, we're able to identify some of the common points. But as Sonika said at the top, when we're trying to get to interesting, what's new, what's emerging, that'll be things that are on the fringes, things that are infrequent, and things that people aren't actually saying. And so I think back to work that Sonika and I were doing a year ago, dealing with a rare disease where patients could only eat a teaspoon of oil a day. And so I'll just say this from my perspective. I went into it, and this is looking back, I went into it with a bias thinking that this sucks. Like, eating is great, and I don't have to really make that argument to anybody, I hope. But the limitations on eating, as someone who has the ability to eat more than a teaspoon of oil a day, just felt a tablespoon, felt like my entire life was spinning. It was ending. It was going to be dramatically affected. And I kind of experienced the dramatic effect of it in every moment. I think one thing that's really interesting as we look at people as patients and then, their broader lifestyle is like, this is something that I have to live with. I'll get back to the example now. When I was doing research and looking at these patients and they were talking, they were saying, yeah, everybody has to eat healthy. So we eat healthy. And that gave me cause to pause, because now I'm looking at the situation and saying, wait a second, are you just coping? Are you delusional? And I will pause the story there to say, there is a level of bias, and that's how I started the story. There's a level of bias that myself, as a medical communicator, took in that instance to say, because I'm projecting my understanding of the disease, how I feel like the disease would affect my life, I'd be devastated, in bed, wouldn't do anything. People are still living on. And I think it goes back to the conversations we had with Ada before, conversations we've had in the past, where, like, the disease can be devastating and life can go on. Like both can exist at the same time. I think there's an important piece for us as far as understanding what's unspoken, how things are spoken, what's existing on the fringes that we need to pay attention to and give some support to and elevate when we have conversations about, almost as much as we do the things that appear very often and very common, just to avoid and break the tropes within our own thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, and you've mentioned it, and I think it's an important point to make of we talk about biases all the time, just in behavioral science, but we as strategists have we've been doing this, we have experience, and we've been doing this, and we have our, you know, ways of thinking that oftentimes, yeah, kind of pushes us to repeating ways of thinking and approaches. And sometimes we just need to like really go in with a clean slate, but that's really hard to do. So I like that point a lot, the power of the unspoken, because how do we actually then decode like silences in conversation, and how do we, if we're doing social listening and we think, this is something that we want to explore conversations around, and there's not conversations around there, then we just forget about it entirely. I mean, I'm not like generalizing, but I do it. I'll just be like, okay, well, that's obviously not that important, and so let's focus on everything that is talked about, because that's oftentimes like a lot of information. But we, should spend time on what's not talked about, because there's often a story there, to your point, Gabe, and I think that's an important one.
Right.
Okay, the last point I think we end on is about culture. So I mentioned that we culture is such a broad word, but we're like, understand the culture of these patients living with a certain disease. And then so we approach, looking at what does culture mean? And there's culture around eating, there's culture around aesthetics, there's culture around rare disease. Like all of these things have its own culture, and we understand that. But when we look at like demographic culture or like, socioeconomic background. And when we do work in the US, we oftentimes think a important part of culture, and globally too, culture is heritage. And it's obviously more than that. And I think we can appreciate that. It's about work, it's about family roles, it's about generational influences, social circles, things like that. I think it was an interesting point that we had this conversation with Jenny around, okay, well, and I think this might have actually come up in a client meeting, but just to kind of share the story that a lot of our clients are global. And so, yes, America's a melting pot, and we have that diversity to pull from. These are people in certain regions make certain health decisions, people in certain economic classes make certain decisions, and all of that. But how do we approach that globally? And in a country where maybe there isn't that much quote unquote diversity, or so we think, because we're looking at diversity a certain way, how do we lean into that? And I think something that, we're talking about, as it seems like we've just been working on a lot of global projects lately, is just redefining and rethinking through what diversity actually means. And so, yes, diversity is a part of culture, but just focusing just on diversity, there's diversity. It's beyond race. It's beyond heritage. It's really about diversity of thought, diversity of, educational background. And so that was something that, like I mentioned, had come up with the client on how, in the UK, for example, should we be approaching understanding diversity and how that's different from the US. And I think it's just, even things like, if you're looking at gender and you're looking at women and you look at working women, and understanding that working within the group of working moms, let's say, there are such differences in different regions as that as a group. And so the diversity of gender diversity is a big piece of different regions and how that's different from the US. And so I think it's just expanding the way that we approach understanding diversity from a global lens, because it's rarely race focused in other areas. And so it's on us to be able to understand what that diversity actually looks like in other regions.
I think that's a great point. And I think another piece of this culture conversation is also cultures of choice. So when we're looking at disease communities, I mean, even putting disease communities aside, it's when we look at the world and cultures, it's subcultures, it's niches. This is the new mainstream. Nothing like, I referenced this before on an episode of the podcast, and you don't have to listen to every episode of the podcast to be caught up on this one, but it's this idea that when you walk into work Monday morning, it's not going to be any more of like, hey, did you see The Simpsons last night? Most people probably did not see the thing that you saw last night. But that's, of course, with the advent of the internet, you're able to find these communities and build these communities in a more tight knit, higher information, higher level way that there aren't a lot of things that really reach and stay on everybody's global radar at the same time. And so when we think about cultures, it is, where you're from, your family, everything like that. But it's also the fact that we stay nimble and that cultures change and that things evolve and that people are online and they look for people who understand their exact niche. So it's not even talking about Simpsons anymore. It's like, who's a fan of Ned Flanders the most? And then there'll be a community of that online. I'm not saying that when we build our strategies, we have to target everybody who's a fan of Ned Flanders, but it's just how we think about how liquid and how quickly changing communities and cultures are that, I'm even intertwining the words as I speak here because I think that they're becoming one and the same subcultures and communities.
Yeah. That's such a good point. And it's so true. We just live in a time where it is so fluid and the belonging isn't so strong where you have like these deep roots. It's everyone sort of, is able to jump around and resonate with different communities and different cultures. And so, yes, as we think about that in our work, thinking about what role that could play in better understanding our consumers is an important one. Okay. Great. So I think we covered off on everything that we've been thinking about, but we realized that there's probably more. I think something that we're really thinking, like I mentioned as I started on this episode, something that we're trying to think more of is how do we better understand our customers? We know what is the way, we know the approach, we know what makes sense, patients are humans first, doctors are humans first, and things exactly like we're talking about. Communities are fluid, and we've said all these things and we know these things. And what I think we want to push the needle on now, even within our group, is how do we actually action on that and do research and generate insight differently. So again, I would love to hear from all of you. I think it's important. So
yeah, I think that would be great to have everybody come in, whether you share medicalanthropology@avos.com. That's where you can reach us. Sonika, people know you, people know me, hopefully Gabriel Allen Cummings. If you work at Avos, just feel free to reach us, send us a note. I think I will also say like one thing, and I know we wanted to keep these episodes nice and tight, but I will say one more thing. Like as we are thinking about the bias that we as medical communicators bring, I think it's also important to extend a level of empathy here because when we talk about doctors and talk about patients, and we can in very clear terms say they are biased in this way, they, racist, sexist, gender, all these different things in these ways, I think it's important to extend a level of empathy there to understand that, even when we could, nail the word and say it for what it is, that's not going to be the thing that creates the behavior change. That, title and naming the bias isn't the unlock. The unlock is like, how does it get switched? Because a lot of times we say things like brands aren't going to be able to correct those things, but it's really the systemic change. How can we change behaviors within a system that is affected by racism, that is affected by bias in these ways? We, as communicators, are also people within a system that it's affected by all these different things. I think it's very easy, and I'll say this as someone, in my career who's very early on, it's very easy to say, oh, well, it's just the doctor's fault. They're not doing this thing right. It's so clear that they should be prescribing X because it's, it makes the patient's life so much better than what they were previously doing. Why don't they just do it? And there's empathy as far as understanding the day-to-day of the doctor, but it's also where they are coming from. And I'm not even talking about culture here, but their mindset, their approach. There are so many things that are outside of our control that I think we need to keep in mind and just, again, practice that level of empathy that, we may feel now that, oh man, I have bias. Where do I have bias? Oh man, it's a similar conversation when we talk about the groups and doctors and patients and everybody that we try to help, especially here at Medical Anthropology.
That's a great point to end on. Well, thank you all for listening. Until next time, I'm Sonika Garcia.
And I'm Gabriel Allen Cummings. Thanks, everybody. Breaking the Code is a podcast by the Havas Medical Anthropology Group. Hosted by Sonika Garcia and Gabriel Allen Cummings, with inspiration coming from all of you. Thank you for listening and for your continued support. If you enjoyed this episode or had any questions for the team, feel free to leave a rating, subscribe, and send us a message to our mailbox at medicalanthropology@havas.com. Until next time.